Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk today, or tonight. My name is Carlota Salvador Megias, and in what follows, I'd like to discuss what is very much a work in progress, an examination of the ways in which the unitive and the contributory aspects of love come apart in Søren Kierkegaard's either-or, a fragment of life. These aspects are typically thought to obtain together. To contribute to our loved one's life requires that we be with her, and to be with her should entail a positive, often eudaimonistic contribution to her life, provided it is our love for her that motivates our presence at her side. We find few exceptions to this formula in contemporary philosophical work about love and friendship, where a disjunction between the unitive and contributory aspects of love isn't framed as a defect, and even fewer classic or canonical works that celebrate it. I submit Søren Kierkegaard's either-or as one such exception. I will examine how the pseudonymous fragments that comprise this text challenge philosophers' assumption that the unitive and contributory aspects of love need always co-occur. However stark the contrast between the earlier so-called aesthetic part of the work and the later so-called ethical part of the work appears, I will show that the thrust of the whole is remarkably consistent on this point of separating the unitive from the contributory. I will proceed by focusing on two of the text's central relationships. First, that of Johannes and Cordelia in the Seducer's Diary fragment from part 1 of the book, and second, that of A and Vilhelm, or B, as it features throughout Wilhelm's letters in part 2. The first is a fairly straightforward case of the contributory and the unitive aspects of love coming apart. How Johannes and Cordelia love each other, and what they love about each other, mandate that he trick her into breaking their engagement. She is then to suffer their separation after they spent a night together in defiance of their milieu's social expectations. As far as Johannes is concerned, their relationship cannot be consummated by something as quotidian as marriage, nor can it last beyond the instant of its fulfillment in such an evening. A cruelty from Cordelia's perspective as much as the reader's, but one that is given by the text as the logical consequence of the love they each grow to have for the other. The second case is more subtle. Wilhelm spends the bulk of his letters to A enjoining him to marry and to commit to a career, flagging this contribution to A's life as one he is in a position to make only by virtue of their separation and as something that rarely features in their face-to-face meetings, devoted as they are to making fun of convention. The picture of marriage Wilhelm gives in these letters is one where love's unitive aspect is the single legitimate justification for it, entirely aside from its obvious, but from justification's perspective, irrelevant, contributory aspect. Understood in this way, Johannes and Vilhelm, two characters whose personalities, proclivities, and attitudes to life seem diametrically opposed, are shown to be reconcilable. What's more, I hope this discussion shows that acknowledging the mere possibility of a disjunction between the unitive and contributory aspects of love and friendship can be a fruitful starting point for philosophizing about these topics in its own right. One more point on methodology before I wrap up this introduction. I believe that when it comes to the activity of philosophy, the centrality of love and friendship in our lives constitutes both a great advantage and their Achilles heel. This is because anyone can have meaningfully philosophical reflections and conversations about love and friendship, regardless of their formal training. But such training cannot always protect the philosopher from conflating a personal or local value, preference, or description. With what is or should be possible or desirable in a particular relationship, for particular persons, from particular sociocultural milieus. Sorry for that little snafu. I stress that by simply presenting some of the relationships that animate either-or, I am not at the same time arguing for them, nor will I suggest Kierkegaard argued for them. Rather, these relationships, and their delivery in a text we might be justified in describing as an archival novel, are of interest to philosophers precisely because they make no pretension to either prescriptive or descriptive universality when given to the reader in this form, and because this form demands the reader's personal engagement in evaluating such relationships. I want to show in this talk and in the Q&A session to follow that the so-called existentialist style of argumentation, if argumentation is the right word for it, has much to contribute to the philosophy of love and friendship as we practice it today. This talk structure will follow the structure of the introduction. First, I'll break down what I mean by the unitive and contributory aspects of love, teasing their relation out from our common intuitions about their content. Then, I'll describe how the picture of their relation, common to both our intuitions and to mainstream philosophical work on love and friendship, is challenged by the seducer's diary and the second part of either or. I will conclude with some questions to facilitate the Q&A session. Please note that when I say our or us throughout this talk, I mean those persons who are in a position to attend events such as this one. Without any further ado, it seems obvious that we should both desire to be with our loved ones and to make a positive contribution to their lives in some form. In fact, stated at this level of abstraction, this description might be taken to exhaust what it means to love another person. I want to be with you. I want the best for you. Who wouldn't think this of someone they care about? The trouble begins, philosophically speaking, when we inquire after the content of what's said here and the ensuing relations between the so-called unitive and contributory aspects of love. What qualifies as being with someone? Are we with someone only when we occupy the same physical space as them? Are we with them so long as we're spending time with them, involved in some activity together, perhaps, give or take our physical proximity? What if, in the course of spending time with them, they have no idea I, as an individual, am there, but are aware of being together with a mass of people who they can at the very least claim are interested in their musical performance, their gaming stream, or their lecture? When we say we want to be with someone, does this mean that we always want to be with them? Does being with our loved one entail that the status of our relationship remain the same, that we continue to be friends, lovers, or family? What is the degree of closeness we have in mind when we say we want to be with someone? What of my emotions and thoughts should I feel able to share with them in order to feel that I am with them? Similarly, how should I be able to share these with them in order to feel that we are together without qualification? I ask this mass of questions so as to bring out the complexity of the unitive aspect of love and to gesture at the ways in which our unity with our beloved depends upon the type of relationship, friendly, familial, fanish, romantic, that we have with them. For example, it seems inappropriate for a fanish relationship to morph into a friendly one, or for the ultimate goal of a fanish relationship to be the development of a friendship, because of the power differential built into most fan-creator dynamics, and because the desire for a friendship on the part of the fan, say, is predicated upon a fundamental inequality between individuals. Conversely, many of us may think of a parent as a kind of friend, but the activities of friendship that characterize our relationship with our parents may be quite different from the ones that characterize our friendships with other individuals, precisely in virtue of the many inequalities that make up parent-child relationships. For example, that our parents are older than us, have raised us, and possess levels of authority that vary depending on the subunit of the family involved. The contributory aspect of love is equally variable and complex. What does it mean to want the best for another person? Does it mean that we want our beloved to be happy? What kind of happiness do we have in mind? Is it a hedonistic one, where we are interested in maximizing our loved one's isolated moments of pleasure? Is it a eudaimonistic one, where we care about their happiness as a function of the fulfillment of a meaningful life plan or the development of good character? Is it some mixture of these? What role, if any, do we, the person who loves them, play in helping them achieve the best for themselves? What if our loved one takes no pleasure in their character development or personal fulfillment in a life plan, to the point that these come at the cost of their happiness? What if their pleasures, life plans, and personality lack consistency, coherence, or come into conflict with our own? These questions about the contributory aspect of love depend as much on the relationship at issue as the ones I asked about the unitive aspect. How we would expect a good parent to contribute to the life of their child, for example, is quite different from how we might say a fan contributes to the life of an entertainer whose work they enjoy, even if both involve a degree of financial investment and enthusiastic interest in their beloved's projects. To put it another way, the unitive aspect of love bears upon or mediates love's contributory aspect, such that the kind of unity that characterizes a parent-child relationship sanctions certain contributions to the life of a loved one that would strike us as highly irregular or outright corrosive in a fan-creator relationship, and vice versa. To sum up the preceding discussion, our intuitions about the kinds of unity that characterize particular relationships, that make them recognizable as just those kinds of relationships, and that scaffold the expectations we have of them, correlate with our intuitions about the kinds of contributions one can and should make to the lives of our loved ones as a friend, partner, parent, and so on. An additional intuition we seem to have is that paradigmatic or near perfect instances of such relationships should maximize both the degree of intimacy particular to the type of relationship we have with our loved one and the amount of appropriate quality contributions we make to our loved one's life. This means that, as a fan, I should try to enjoy as much of my favorite creators' content as I can, familiarize myself with their public persona while reminding myself that it is just that, a persona, and seek to understand how their creations relate to other works, mediums, and artists within their ambit. As a parent, I should strive to be a safe, stable source of comfort and encouragement for my child, whose development as a person I should support, be curious about, and constructively challenge. Nowhere are these relations between the unitive and the contributory aspects of love more obvious than in close friendships and romantic relationships. On this side, I present a typically Aristotelian formulation of a superior friendship in terms of the unitive and contributory variables I gave before. They obtain between equals, they are physically proximate, they are reciprocated, they are stable over a long period of time, and they feature a free exchange of feelings and ideas that contribute to the eudaimonistic good of each friend, both when it comes to their life plans and their characters, without at the same time infringing on either's personal autonomy. One might cash out romantic relationships in a similar way. This Aristotelian picture is a familiar starting point and touchstone in the philosophy of friendship, even among philosophers who are critical of it or who do not describe friends' contributions to each other's lives in terms of eudaimonistic flourishing. Now, having covered all this ground, we can ask, how does either or challenge this picture common to both our sociocultural milieu's popular imagination and to philosophies of love and friendship that are in conversation with the predominant Aristotelian tradition? To answer this question, I'll turn to the two relationships I mentioned in my introduction. First, Johannes and Cordelia's affair in the Seducer's Diary fragment, and second, Vilhelm and A's friendship as it's portrayed in Wilhelm's letters on the value of marriage and the proper development of the personality in part 2 of Either Or. I'll anticipate what's coming here. These relationships, and to some extent the reflections on love and friendship that feature in them, are a far cry from the Aristotelian ideal I've just outlined. What's more, the ways in which they depart from this ideal teach us two additional things about the unitive and the contributory aspects of love. One is that the unitive and the contributory aspects of love need not co-occur in a friendship or a romantic relationship in order for it to have value as just that friendship or romantic relationship. That is to say, our intuitions about these aspects' correlation, that certain contributions to the life of a loved one follow from a certain union with them and vice versa, may be unrealizable in or undesirable to different types of friendships and romantic relationships that are nonetheless valuable to their constituents, and where this value is not derived from how these friendships and romantic relationships compare to some ideal setting standard. The relationships I will discuss from Either Or will highlight the fact that some contributions to a friend or partner's life must be predicated upon an emotional or physical distance between them, where that distance isn't understood as a defect, must involve a species of self-discipline at odds with our expectation about the free exchange of feelings and ideas with those closest to us, may already contain their end in the instant of their beginning, may feature lopsided commitments and conflicting interests, and may disengage the unitive from the contributory when justifying the relationship's value. I submit that all this is not as bizarre or tragic as it may initially appear. The other thing these relationships show us is that maximizing one aspect need not entail maximizing the other in a given friendship or partnership. In fact, Maximizing or prioritizing the contributory aspect may require breaking with or consciously devaluing the unitive, and vice versa. Some may immediately object that the participants to these relationships are mistaken about their real value, an objection that is particularly powerful against persons like Johannes, who, on an uncharitable reading of the seducer's diary, is manipulative, self-absorbed, paternalistic, and at the very least disinclined to separate fiction from reality, if not outright incapable of doing so. Setting aside qualms about the content of real here, where, after all, is the value of a given relationship negotiated and decided, if not between the individuals who comprise it? It may very well be the case that these relationships are terminally impoverished. But this does not mean that these relationships, as pictures which the individual reader must piece together for herself from either or's many fragments, lack the same philosophical, pedagogical value that we so readily believe her ideal intuitions have. The myriad ways in which the reader is drawn into engaging with such first-personal, complex accounts of love and friendship, where her opinion of their value and the ways in which this opinion of their value is developed implicate her capacities for empathy, curiosity, self-questioning, and imagination, and are, I believe, integral to philosophizing about social practices where one's selfhood is at stake, such as practices of intimacy. I will be clear that I am not saying we should do away with intuition or ideal-based accounts of love and friendship that proceed by axiomatic definitions of the good, simple thought experiments, or not always self-consciously limited conceptions of personhood in favor of, say, reflectively reading novels. I am saying that works which explicitly invite our capacities for empathy, curiosity, self-questioning, imagination, and so on, like either or does, can diversify, nuance, and problematize those conclusions drawn from our intuitions about what life is or should be like. This is valuable because it makes others' lived experiences more available to us, both as private individuals and as philosophers. It expands and refines our conception of what is valuable in our own lives and in the lives of others. And it can mark the beginning of practices of friendship, romantic partnership, and other relationships that are more hospitable to the persons involved in them, as well as to philosophies that are more receptive to these. It is also a fitting spirit to take to either or, a text with which the reader should enter into a relation of self-activity free of Kierkegaard's authority, or so he wrote in his journals. Let's turn now to the seducer's diary and the affair at its heart, Johannes and Cordelia. The function of this lengthy fragment in either or is to serve as a fulcrum between the first part of the text, containing works by A, and the second part of the text, comprised of Wilhelm's letters. According to A, he chances upon this diary written by his friend Johannes, and in the course of reading it comes to feel a deeply personal, existential horror at its contents, for the ways in which it both perfects and deconstructs the ideal, so-called aesthetic individual much of his own authorship is at pains to describe, a kind of life poet. The turn to Wilhelm's so-called ethical viewpoint, which he entreats A to adopt throughout his letters, emerges as a natural one for the text to take and for A to follow. This is a common interpretation and one that is arguably present in the very premise of the book, which features its editor, Victor Aramita, finding A's papers and Wilhelm's letters locked inside a desk that Aramita buys secondhand. It seems the intellectual dilettante who made it a point to commit to nothing and to no one may have given up that life for another if the desk is any indication, be it because of Johannes's diary, Wilhelm's letters, or both. It is noteworthy that such dissimilar characters can be interpreted as making the same contribution to A's life and in the same indirect fashion, but I'll say more on that a bit later. What is it about Johannes and Cordelia's relationship that so horrifies A? From Johannes's point of view, the relationship has two aims: its consummation in a tryst as opposed to a marriage, and the development of what he repeatedly refers to as Cordelia's womanhood, something which a reader might, on a more charitable interpretation highlighting the affinity Johannes claims he has to Cordelia, understand as her authentic self. In a typical entry, Johannes writes, "Do I love Cordelia? Yes. Genuinely? Yes. Faithfully? Yes. In an aesthetic sense, and surely even that means something. What good would it do to this girl if she fell into the hands of a numbskull of a faithful husband? What would become of her? Nothing. Sternly and temperately, I keep myself in check, so that everything there is in her, all her divinely rich nature, is allowed to unfold. I am one of the few that can do that, she one of the few who are fit for it. Are we then not suited to each other? Much has been written about the forms of misogyny found throughout either or that I do not have the space to discuss here. Neither do I wish to be misunderstood as accepting my source text misogyny, but I would like to bracket it so as to focus on the unique ways the unitive and contributory aspects of love feature in Johannes and Cordelia's relationship. Theirs is a relationship that reaches a fever pitch by the interplay of emotional and physical distances that are at first set, then breached. In, for example, the flurry of letters Johannes sends to Cordelia after they've become engaged. It is dominated by militaristic adversarial metaphors seemingly at odds with their mutual infatuation. It requires both parties, and Johannes in particular, to discipline their emotions and behaviors, though it is clear from Johannes's writing that this does not affect, and could even be said to improve, their ability to engage each other intellectually. The relationship's superficial instability, the making and subsequent breaking of their engagement by Cordelia herself, becomes for Johannes the proof of both Cordelia's personal development and an indication that they understand their relationship in the same way. The relationship's cruelty lies in a conflict that Cordelia, at the very least, had been unaware of until their tryst ended. Johannes knew his feelings for Cordelia wouldn't endure their consummation, but never clarified this for her or so much as hinted it. This is a challenging relationship to imagine and to read about, and one that I do not want to be taken as supporting or as claiming that Kierkegaard supported. His reflections on how either or should be read and A's reaction to the diary should make this clear, regardless of one's interpretation of how the book's fragments and characters hang together. But setting aside hermeneutical considerations about the extent to which we should believe Johannes's version of events, it raises important questions about the values and personalities that animate what is to most readers a distasteful disjunction between the unitive and the contributory aspects of love, particularly given that the diary contains some of Kierkegaard's most beautiful prose about it. What then of Wilhelm's friendship with A? This is a bifurcated relation, comprised of their in-person dynamic on the one hand and Wilhelm's written correspondence to A on the other. While Wilhelm calls A his friend time and time again in these letters, he is hyper-conscious of the fact that they are not friends in the fullest sense of the word, at least by Wilhelm's self-consciously Aristotelian standards. That would require them to share a life view, one that brings A out of his preference for serial, isolated hedonisms and into pleasures that are mediated by commitments to a particular person and vocation. It is precisely here where much of the impetus behind Wilhelm's writing to A lies. He claims that A can neither reveal himself to others nor permit others to share themselves with him, in spite of a remarkable potential for developing life-changing intimacies, and claims that for A, this is a terrible loss. Wilhelm is convinced that he and A are, at heart, kindred spirits, in part because neither of them would ever sacrifice themselves to the kind of poetic existence that so provoked A when he encountered it in Johannes's diary. But this is something that A's reserve is too great for Wilhelm to broach directly in conversation, hence his letters. Yet Wilhelm's affection for A isn't concerned with a strictly contributory interest in the improved person whom A could become, however much Wilhelm might posture otherwise. His passion for A, the person he could be, as much as the ridiculous person he is palpable throughout these letters. Wilhelm writes, "You who in spite of all your bizarrerie, I love like a son, a brother, a friend, who I love with an aesthetic love, since perhaps sometime you will find a center for your eccentric movements, who I love for your impetuosity, your passions, your foibles, who I love with the fear and trembling of a religious love, because I see in what ways you have gone astray, and because for me you are something quite other than mere appearance." In spite of himself, Wilhelm enjoys and even sympathizes with the ways A pokes fun at the conventions of marriage. He cherishes the seemingly free disregard with which A expresses himself in his presence despite A's opinions being so at odds with what Wilhelm himself believes. That is, if the detail with which Wilhelm writes about A's person is any indication of affection. That Wilhelm hedges and hesitates to accept how much he appreciates the so-called corrosive aspects of A's company is belied by his keen memory for A's antics and the ways in which Wilhelm catches himself valuing A for that which he's trying to convince A to change. The supreme irony of Wilhelm's friendship with A seems to be that his contributory interest in A's life runs counter to the spirit of those moments when they are actually together, the beating heart of their friendship, and that which makes A remarkable person in Wilhelm's estimation. There's much more I could say, but I'm aware of the time and would like to make a few concluding comments before I bring this talk to a close with some questions. Please do feel free to ask me about the particulars of either or in the Q&A session, as those of you who have read it know that there are an immense amount of details and considerations I've been unable to include here. This short sketch has almost exclusively concentrated on those elements of Johannes and Vilhelm that they have in common, the primary element being the nature of their relationships to Cordelia and A, respectively. Both men believe that these persons are ones whose lives they can contribute to at a distance and in virtue of a deep felt similarity. Both dynamics mock convention in conversation and action, and despite a world of difference between them that any casual reader of either or could gather, Johannes and Wilhelm's views on, for example, the pointlessness of a marriage engagement, the value of disclosing the inward, and the contributory's disjunction from the unitive are at the very least non-contradictory, if not broadly coherent. It seems safe to say that analyzing love in terms of the unitive and the contributory also pays some dividends for traditionally philosophical activity and philosophically minded analyses of literary works. Nonetheless, I wonder, and I wish to ask you all, what features of interpersonal relationships might this distinction obfuscate or falsify? Are there more fruitful ways of understanding what I've described as their disjunction in these and in other relationships than the ones that are set by the very terms themselves? What revisionary, reflective work about our practices of intimacy do these concepts and the ways in which they come together and come apart facilitate or frustrate? What imaginative latitude do they provide? Thank you for your attention.